That day started like most of the days in the palace. I was enjoying the company of my ladies as usual. But then a disaster struck. While I was talking to a friend, I saw one of my ladies-in-waiting rushing in, clutching a sheet of paper. Out of breath, she handed the paper to me. Disturbed by her anxious frown, I hesitantly accepted the paper. It might have been dropped accidentally by an official outside my chamber. As I read, my face turned pale and my disbelief turned to horror. It was a list of heretical charges against me, signed by the king. I cried out. But for the support of my friends, I would have sunk to the ground. I tried to calm myself, to think clearly, but I was too disturbed. Mercifully, my ladies-in-waiting helped me to bed. I lay down, but I couldn't rest. I began reviewing the events of my marriage to King Henry VIII. I was 31, twice married and widowed, and was considering marriage to the dashing Thomas Seymour, who I was in love with. But the king had other plans. He proposed. How could I refuse? It was certainly an honor, but one fraught with big challenges. I became his sixth wife on July 12, 1543. My husband was no longer the jousting, athletic man of his youth. He was 52, greatly overweight, subject to sudden changes of mood, and plagued with ulcers in his legs to the extent that at times he could hardly walk and had to be conveyed in a chair. Yet, I had drawn on my intelligence and whatever talents I had to make our marriage work. I tried to be an entertaining wife, and I ordered these beautiful black nightgowns to be looking attractive to him. I also tried my best to become a companion to Henry's 3 children from his previous marriages, knowing that young Edward and Elizabeth had never had a motherly figure in their life. I'd asked Henry to bring his daughters to court, so that he could enjoy a peaceful family life he hadn't had for years with his turbulent and short-lived marriages. When his leg was aching, I would often nurse him, holding his leg in my lap and distracting the king with some lively discussion, often on religious matters. I believe I was able to bring some measure of tranquility into his life. So what could I have done wrong? I tried to review my recent meeting with the king. That evening some of his courtiers were present, and he seemed to be in a good mood. As was my custom, I raised a religious question we had discussed before. He was peevish and cut me short. I was surprised but dismissed it as moodiness on his part. Usually he enjoyed such discussions and did not object to my interest in religious matters. I tried to recollect my memories of who was present on that occasion. And my thoughts persistently returned to one man, Stephen Gardiner, a known enemy of mine. He is a bishop of Winchester and a royal councillor, an influential man at court, and an opposer of religious reform. He resents me, both for my interest in religious change and for my influence with the king. My thoughts took me away back to the time when Henry, desperate for a male heir, wondered how he could legally rid himself of Catherine of Aragon and marry a younger wife who could give him a son. Since he had failed to get permission from the Pope to annulate his marriage, the king decided to take drastic steps to resolve his matrimonial problem. Eventually, Henry's marital difficulties were solved with the help of his chief advisor Thomas Cromwell and the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. The English Church broke with the Church of Rome, and the king became head of the English Church. Cranmer had Henry's marriage to Catherine annulled in 1533. By this time Henry had already married Anne Boleyn, who was pregnant. This release from papal authority had profound repercussions. Cromwell was given unlimited authority over the church and was subject only to the king. Progressively, the monasteries were demolished and their properties handed over to the crown, providing much-needed revenue. In addition, Cromwell played a vital role in the printing and distributing of the Bible in English, pressuring to impose the Great Bible upon the English Church. As the Bible became more accessible to the public, it had a profound effect on people's view of Orthodox religion. The unaffected simplicity which marked the lives of Jesus Christ and the apostles stood in bizarre contrast with the great wealth, and splendid architectural exploits of the Catholic Church. As for Henry, he expressed some interest in certain religious reforms, but his policies were often dictated by political expediency rather than by strong religious conviction. He was well aware of the two opposing factions at court, those for reform and those who wanted to maintain traditional religion, the conservatives. To keep the upper hand, he would adroitly play one group against the other. By 1540, the golden era of reform was interrupted by the downfall of Cromwell. When Henry's chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, maneuvered Gardiner out of his position as principal secretary to the king, Gardiner sought an opportunity to retaliate. He was involved in the plot that caused Cromwell's downfall and execution. Gardiner was also frustrated because Henry had overlooked him and appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury the comparatively obscure Thomas Cranmer, who had Protestant sympathies. Fortunately for Cranmer, Henry thwarted a plot hatched against him by Gardiner and others. For a time, the Conservatives seemed to have the upper hand. But they were unable to halt the reform that had already taken root, since many people wanted to worship God free from the false teachings of men and traditions that contaminated the Roman Catholic faith. I personally showed great interest in the new religious teachings. And, although I tried to be careful in my choice of words and topics for discussions, I was able to take advantage of my queenship, and was the first woman in England who published 4 religious works under her own name. When Henry married me, those at court, who supported Protestant views, including my ladies-in-waiting and their husbands, took heart. But the Conservatives were not prepared to give up without a fight. Their scheming and court intrigues have embroiled me in a desperate fight for my own life. They knew very well that, once they got rid of me, they would regain their power at court. The danger to me and my ladies at court is accentuated by another recent scheme of Bishop Gardiner. A young woman, Anne Askew, was an outspoken advocate of religious reform. She was in prison, awaiting execution for heresy. But Gardiner was interested in her for another reason. He wanted evidence that she had contact with influential ladies at court, which could also incriminate me. An associate of Gardiner, Thomas Wriothesley, one of the king's leading counsellors, went to question Anne Askew. Wriothesley interrogated Anne for some time, but he did not get the incriminating evidence he needed. Finally, he ordered her to be strapped on the rack, although it was illegal to use this instrument of torture on a woman. When this failed to make her talk, Wriothesley and another counsellor turned the rack themselves and stretched her to the limit, but they still did not get the desired information. The thought of Anne Askew's suffering reduces me to tears. At this moment, one of my ladies interrupts my thoughts and tells me that the king's physician, Dr. Wendy, has been sent by the king to examine me. He must have heard me crying. The kindly doctor asks how I am and conveys the king's concern for my health. The doctor explains how the king confided to him the plot against me and swore him to secrecy. Nevertheless, Dr. Wendy tells me the whole story, that after I left the king that night, he sarcastically commented that it was very comforting to him in his old age to be taught by his wife. Gardiner seized his opportunity and said that the Queen harbored heretics and that her activities were treasonable, posing a threat to the king's authority. He said that if allowed the time, he and others could put before the king evidence of this. The king got angry and agreed to sign a bill of articles against me. After recounting these events, Dr. Wendy urged me to go to the king at the earliest opportunity and humbly ask his forgiveness. That was the only way to outwit my enemies, who would not rest until I was a prisoner in the Tower and until they had enough evidence to condemn me to death. I saw the wisdom of the doctor's advice, and late at night, upon hearing that the king was in his chambers, I dressed up carefully and rehearsed what I was going to say. The king was sitting and joking with some of his gentlemen. He welcomed me with a smile. Then he changed the conversation to religious matters. He asked me to resolve doubts he had on some points. I saw the trap immediately. So I tried my best to respond with sincerity and honesty. I mentioned that God created woman after the man, inferior to him. Since therefore,
God has appointed such a natural difference between man and woman, and your majesty being so excellent in gifts and ornaments of wisdom. And I, a silly poor woman, so much inferior in all respects of nature to you, how then comes it now to pass that your majesty, in such causes of religion, will seem to require my judgment? Which when I have uttered and said what I can, yet must I, and will I, refer to my judgment in this, and in all other cases, to your majesty's wisdom, as my only anchor, supreme head and governor here in earth, next under God, to lean.
I explained to him further that when I spoke with him on religious matters and at times expressed an opinion, it was not to promote my ideas. Rather, by engaging in conversation, I hoped to distract him from the pain he felt because of his infirmity. The king replied, "And is it even so, sweetheart? And tended your arguments to no worse end? Then perfect friends we are now again, as ever at any time before." Still seated, he summoned me to himself, embraces me warmly, and kisses me. Then he said that hearing this news was better than receiving a sudden gift of £100,000. We continued in pleasant conversation until he gave me permission to leave about midnight. The next day the king took his customary walk in the royal garden, accompanied by 2 gentlemen of his bedchamber. He had summoned me to join him, and I appeared there with 3 of my ladies. Henry had neglected to tell me that was the time formally agreed upon for my arrest. He had also failed to inform Wriothesley, who was to carry out the arrest, of our reconciliation. While we were enjoying ourselves, Wriothesley arrived with 40 of the king's guards to arrest me along with my ladies. Then Henry separated from the party and summoned Wriothesley, who dropped to his knees. We could not hear what the king was saying, but we did hear him utter in rage the words, "Knave," "Beast," "Fool." After that he ordered Wriothesley to get out of his sight. When the king returned to me, I tried to pacify him with mild words. I even spoke in Wriothesley's behalf, saying that whatever he had done may have been done in error. To that the king responded, "On my word, sweetheart, he has been toward you an arrant knave, and so let him go." My life was saved. Gardner lost the king's favor. The game was over.